Good morning. Welcome back to the Convo Couch. Pasta Jardula.
I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue spinning on the ones and twos. Fams, everybody's already saying, what are you guys doing up so early? What's going on? Why are you guys up so early? Well, fam, why don't you tell them why we're up so early?
Well, we have our guest with us, and, you know, we love having this guest on. It's the second time we'll have her on. And every time she comes on, it's just like a mind, like a mind blow. Like, you're just like, it's just, we had her on the last time she was here. We talked about something happening after the election and everything that we have feared regarding the Biden administration has occurred. I mean, and it's gotten worse as far as the surveillance state, the crackdown of authoritarian attempts to pretty much name every single one of us as a domestic violent extremist. And we thought it was important, too, regarding the coverage I was doing in Peru, to actually paint the picture of really what are the dangers of, Keiko Fujimori and the background. So Whitney Webb is here with us today.
Yes. How are you, Whitney?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for getting up early since I am 8 hours ahead of you. That's really nice.
Thank you for doing this. We really, really appreciate it. We know you're busy, and we know there's a lot of reading and reporting and writing. So, I don't there's been so much going on. And I went to Peru, as you know, right? And you have lived in South America. You have lived in Peru. And first of all, what is your knowledge of the background of the Fujimori family? Because they're crazy.
Yeah, I would agree with the crazy characterization. I sort of view the original Fujimori, who was president for Peru of Peru during the 1990s, as sort of like a Pinochet-esque figure, but for Peru, involved in the mass privatization of a lot of stuff, and a huge benefit of the oligarch class and a lot of inequality. And also being very authoritarian, backing death squads, among other things. So I actually got interested in the politics there because when I lived in Peru, actually straight out of college, I went to manage a farm owned by an American expat in this region of Peru that's really rural, that you probably know, Apurimac, which is actually where a lot of the mining, industry in Peru happens to be based. And that's also where this extremist group was based, called Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, which is what Fujimori, used to justify his funding of death squads. Of course, Sendero Luminoso and the Shining Path, they were murderers. They did kill peasants. They weren't like the good guys or anything, right? But the way Fujimori responded to them was to fund right-wing death squads, sort of in the same model that was done in Colombia, Central America, and elsewhere with U.S. backing, during that around that same period of time. And so, I actually interacted with a lot of people that had been impacted by that group, and also impacted by Fujimori's policies. And of course, Fujimori as well, Keiko Fujimori's dad, had changed a lot of mining laws in Peru, basically giving mining companies free reign in a lot of ways, including making them completely tax exempt. They didn't have to pay any royalties, even until they recuperated their initial investments. They were allowed to install and operate in places. And if there were revolts or uprising from, locals in the area, a lot of times the Peruvian military could be brought in. And I heard a lot of stories from people, because I live not that far from a place where there used to be a mine, and there were mining, workers housing for people working in the mine. And basically this one village had basically several people from it had basically gone to light the workers' barracks on fire as a way to stop the mine, because they didn't really have any voice in the government. And if you're familiar with how really, really rural people in Peru live, they really are like voiceless, and just don't have a lot of agency. And oftentimes they feel like they have to take justice into their own hands. So that's essentially what happened. And then I heard that from these people that the Peruvian military had come in, took the ringleaders of this supposed revolt, and basically put like bags over their heads and march them off cliffs and stuff like that. So that's sort of like the Peruvian Fujimori style approach to this type of stuff down there. So obviously you have someone like, Pedro Castillo, won the election looking to take power. He's already openly said that he wants a lot of these mining companies to pay more in taxes, something they have not done. Obviously, these mining companies would favor a Fujimori administration, given the precedents there with them, making mining companies tax exempt, most of whom actually I don't even know if there is a Peruvian mining company running a big mining project in Peru. It's mostly Chinese companies, American, Canadian, or Australian companies that run this, and they don't really, the local people don't get or see any of that money, right? So there's a lot of powerful interests in that particular sector that don't want Castillo to come to power. And you have to keep in mind, in context of Peru's economy, their main export is minerals and things they take from mines, followed by, oil and gas and stuff like that. It's kind of similar to Chile in a lot of ways in that respect. So, this instability that's been provoked after the election with Fujimori trying to say that there was fraud and all of this stuff and trying to delay the results and everything that's going on there, and talk of a potential military coup to prevent Castillo from coming to power. This is all really dangerous. But I would argue that a big driver of this would be concern from the mining industry. And this is because, sorry, I need to take a breath because that's like a lot of stuff.
No, you're good.
Yeah, but, I also recently wrote, for example, about what's been going on in Africa, how in the past year, there's been, I think, maybe 5 or 6 leaders now in Africa that have died under mysterious or sudden circumstances that in any other year would be a big deal. And so some people have argued that it's because of their COVID policies or lack thereof, or things like that may have had an influence on that. But in the case of like Tanzania, for example, I definitely think it had more to do with the president nationalizing and kicking out massive mining companies from huge mining projects that are essential to the fourth industrial revolution, which a lot of people don't really talk about, but they really should, because the oligarch class is talking about it constantly.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Whitney. I just wanted to, because most of our audience, a good chunk of them, know what that is, but there are still substantial amounts of people that don't really know like the basic terms of what that is. What exactly is the fourth industrial revolution for those people who don't know?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to define it, but I guess in the context of this conversation, it's about remaking the economy to be much more tech-based and automation and really machine-based, which means a lot more like lithium-ion batteries and different types of batteries being used to power things. Let's move to electric cars. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, all of that, and also like massive, data centers like the ones the NSA has. Corporations are making those in preparation for this big change that they foresee happening in the not so distant future. All of that requires a lot of infrastructure to be built and established. And that infrastructure requires a lot of rare minerals or particular minerals to develop. So I would argue that whereas, in previous decades, a lot of manipulations of elections, overthrows of governments, coups, things like that were happening because of, hydrocarbon politics, oil, gas, that type of stuff, or pipelines. What we're seeing now is a lot of this is instead being driven by basically a proxy war, you could argue, between Western mining companies and Chinese mining companies to establish control over these mineral resources, which are mostly concentrated in Africa, in the Andes. And of course, China itself has a lot of rare earth minerals. So the US knows that, well, China has this advantage we do not have, so we need to get as much of the other resources around and gobble them up before China can, essentially. So in a lot of these countries like Ecuador, for example, when Rafael Correa was in power, he favored Chinese mining companies over Western mining companies. And I'm sure the expectation is with Castillo, it'll be the same. Evo Morales did something similar in Bolivia. Right before that coup, they had the nationalized lithium project that was between Bolivia and a Chinese firm. And then, of course, the coup government is installed. And then the Añez government is in talks with like Elon Musk to have them develop that lithium project instead. So I think people need to start looking at this as a driver of a lot of this election meddling or coups or manipulations of governments that are going on in the developing world right now, because it's not really about oil anymore like it used to be. They're on to the next game, and they're on to minerals.
Yeah, it's no longer about oil, it's about minerals. I don't know where to go from this right now, because I want to go ask questions about, does that also have to do with the deep sea ocean mining? But let's stay in Peru for a second.
Probably, but yeah.
Because I hear that, I was like, why are we mining the bottom of the ocean? It's like, there's minerals there. We're in a race to grab all the minerals on the planet right now, and it's us versus the Chinese, supposedly, yada, yada, yada. But in Peru right now, what do you think will happen if either Castillo gets anointed as president, or gets to be the president, however you want to say it, or if Fujimori is named president? What two scenarios will we be looking at if it's one or the other?
Ooh. It's hard to say because Peru's really polarized on this issue right now. Like, even though Fujimori was like insane, the Fujimori family is known for their insane corruption. Like, Keiko Fujimori is under investigation for money laundering while running for president. Her father was so corrupt that he fled the country and tried to resign by fax because he was going to be like, he was impeached for corruption. I mean, they're just known to be super corrupt, but they have a lot of defenders in Peru that think, oh, if a leftist comes to power, the worst thing will happen. And that's also very similar to the climate in Chile, for example, where, even though Pinochet did horrible things, there's people that support him and say, well, if Allende had been allowed to be president any longer, it would have been so much worse. There's a lot of, apologists there. And so even if, us in the West think of, these figures as obviously corrupt and horrible, in their home countries, they do still have a lot of support, which may surprise you, but it is something that happens. So I think if Castillo manages to establish an administration and all of that, he's obviously going to have a ton of resistance from Peru's oligarch class, and not just them within Peru, but also right-wing governments that are associated with the Organization of American States. You're going to have pressure from Chile for sure, which is currently led by Sebastián Piñera. Even though Chile has an election at the end of November, who knows? They've been delaying elections and all sorts of things, using COVID as an excuse this whole time. And essentially, the military in Chile is doing some interesting and very concerning things right now. So in Peru also, there's been talks of like ex-military officials saying there needs to be a coup against Castillo and stuff. Fujimori has tried to run for president. I think this is her third unsuccessful attempt. She's sort of like Hillary in that regard. And well, I really think of her as like Latin America's Hillary Clinton. In my head. But she's really desperate. This is like really her last chance to get to be president of Peru. So she may attempt to go scorched earth if that is denied her. And she's already doing that, right? So if Castillo gets in, she may try and go further. In that case, it really comes to the popular support Castillo has to allow him to remain in power and to allow that stability, to stay in Peru while he's president. I would hope that would be the case, but Peru hasn't had a left-leaning president in I don't know when. It's been a pretty long time. That's for sure. But then, of course, Evo Morales had to fight against similar circumstances when he first came to power, and same with, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and stuff. So it is possible, and of course, it depends on the amount of popular support he commands and whether his supporters will come out and support him if there are efforts to illegally remove him from office. If Fujimori manages to get in, it's obviously, I think, going to lead to instability as well, but we'll have Peru become much more authoritarian and just use the Fujimori family method of responding to unrest, which is send in the military, essentially, or, just an authoritarian clampdown, which I really hope does not come to pass. But, as I pointed out from, anecdotes I'm familiar with from my time in Peru, when that type of regime is in power, they just really don't care. All they care about is maintaining the status quo for the business interests that keep them in power, which more often than not are foreign and not Peruvian.
Yeah.
I had a follow-up real quick.
Sure.
Just a lot of people, geopolitically always go, well, when it came to Bolivia, Morales was all about China, and the other regime was about helping the West. Can that be said the same for Peru? Are people going to say that, Castillo is just going to be a puppet for China, and he's going to give them all the minerals, as opposed to Fujimori, who's going to be very beneficial for the West to get in? Or is that just kind of bullshit talk?
So, that's the talking point they will use. And it tends to be true that those governments that are not aligned with the U.S. and sort of rebuke U.S. efforts to meddle in their countries tend to align themselves with either China or Russia. But oftentimes that's because what other players are in the game when you're not part of the U.S. empire, right? So it ultimately... bringing it down to that, he's going to give it all to China. Yeah, that basically plays into a lot of this Cold War 2.0 with China, the China hawkishness, and all of this. But if you actually look, at China, they have a lot of this Orwellian stuff and fourth industrial revolution stuff that's being, rolled out in some Western countries, China's also doing, and there's a lot of billionaires from the West involved in driving those efforts in China, like Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone Capital, very involved in things over there. So, it's not necessarily as clear cut as people like to make things out necessarily. And I don't really think, China are the good guys here. They happen to be the superpower that's not the US, right? And so, for these countries in Latin America that try and pull away from the US, which sees Latin America as its backyard, you oftentimes have to go to the other superpower just to manage to survive efforts from the U.S. empire to bring you back into the fold, as it were. So it's really a marriage of convenience, not because any of these leaders are obsessed with China or card carrying members of the CCP or whatever. That may be the talking point, but the reality is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, thank you.
Just shifting a little bit, I've heard your interview with Cory Morningstar regarding the fourth industrial revolution, the Green New Deal. Right now, a lot of the left is focusing on, this climate crisis that we're having. We're having obviously high spikes in temperature in the north, where the Gulf of Mexico was on fire from a spill. It's just kind of been one thing after the other of crazy.
Right.
So because Robbie Yeager, who's a wonderful reporter, did a whole deep dive into the Sunrise Movement and exposing their money ties, and they're taking dark money. Why is the Green New Deal, right? For people who don't know, basically just a shell for more privatization of a lot of the resources and things that people actually love.
Right. So as far as Green New Deal legislation goes, I'm just most familiar with the original proposal that AOC had when she first came out, because I did write about that document specifically for Mint Press. And, contrary to the public talking points about what that would entail, if you actually read that document, it was about in creating things like carbon markets. And things like that, which actually big oil companies and Wall Street banks overwhelmingly support, despite the fact that they're often accused by the same people supporting, AOC and that type of legislation as, the bad guys. Well, why are the bad guys backing this, right? As far as the Green New Deal goes, there's a lot of corruption going on here, and it's largely being handed to initiatives or companies backed by the same billionaires that created the climate crisis. So I think people need to be really skeptical of a lot of these talking points that are wheeled out. And really, is it necessary for tech to save us? Specific technologies to save us? Aren't there better ways to go about this? I think honestly, more often than not, a lot of the climate tech and green tech stuff is really just a way to get people to buy into this whole fourth industrial revolution thing, which, as you mentioned in my podcast with Corey Morningstar, we talked about how actually once the fourth industrial revolution, which is being sold as a greener, more sustainable future by the World Economic Forum and its partners, will actually not be very green at all, because a lot, as we have already mentioned, it depends on a lot of mining. That mining is very exploitative and environmentally destructive. A lot of places where that mining takes place, the water table is totally destroyed. The environment is filled with things like mercury, among other things, in the cases of gold mines. Very environmentally destructive, not good at all. And you have to have lots of construction of data center after data center after data center to be able to put everything on the cloud and make everything function in the digital world on the digital level, which is what they want to do with all these interconnected smart cities and all of that. That is going to produce a ton or require a ton of electricity that they're not going to be able to use through sustainable means. And they've already said this. And this is why, if you look at the plans of like the World Economic Forum and groups like that, promoting this type of stuff, they're very much promoting nuclear power. And nuclear power plants is sort of a way forward here. And of course, nuclear power plants, aren't necessarily clean, because there can be Chernobyls or 3 Mile Islands and all of this stuff. They can pollute the environment as well. So, there tends to be a lot of propaganda mixed in with things that are actually true there. And so I think we just, the people on the left specifically in the US need to be a lot more discerning, because the fourth industrial revolution is set up to benefit billionaires and the oligarch class, not regular people. It's essentially erasing the natural world and replacing it with a digital synthetic equivalent. And if you really want to save the environment, why would you support moving towards that future? So I think some of these environmental groups that are funded by dark money and stuff like the Sunrise Movement are really just organizations set up by billionaires that want to get people to move towards that future by basically tricking them in a way into thinking that it's actually what's environmentally sustainable and what's not. So in the example of agriculture, there's a lot of push to basically take farm workers out of the equation, replace farm workers with machines and AI. But all of that, you could also just move instead to like small, sustainable permaculture farms and all of this stuff based on like actual natural systems, and revive the bee population and all of this stuff. None of that type of stuff is included in these plans. It's automating everything, taking humans and nature out of the equation as much as possible, and moving to like a machine-driven society. In an AI-driven society, I think the oligarchs here think that by manipulating people's care and love of the environment, they can get people to buy into this future by selling it correctly. But we have to think about, what that end game that they're trying to sell us actually looks like in practice, and sort of go back and critically analyze a lot of these talking points that we're being fed.
Yeah, it's crazy when you get looking down the rabbit hole and listen to the nuances of the situation. And I also believe the Green New Deal never even kind of like looked at military bombing as part of like
purposefully.
Well, the U.S. military, is one of the world's biggest polluters. I wrote about that for Midpress. It's the biggest consumer of fossil fuels in the world and all of this stuff. And none of these plans address that at all. Zero. And like the Navy. I think the year I wrote that article for Midpress, maybe it was 2018, went and dropped like 14 tons of mercury in Puget Sound near Seattle. And that's like fine for these people. It didn't get any coverage at all. That's crazy. And a lot of like the beaching of whales and stuff, like one year in Chile, like 400 whales were beached and died because the Navy was doing exercises and left a bunch of like active sonar equipment in the ocean and just left it there when they finished and stuff. The military doesn't care, but they're also planning for climate change at the same time. They're planning, for all this crazy stuff like cyborg soldiers and AI drones and all of this stuff. So do you really think it's about when the military is doing it, it's because they want to protect the environment? Or is it because they're trying to move into this machine-driven, future, and they want to justify it to the public as being that they care about the environment? we can't be naive here. We have to remember that the institutions and the billionaires, the military, predatory billionaires, these are groups that progressives traditionally do not trust. And I think that's why they need groups, front groups, whether it's Sunrise or something else, to sort of herd them along to get them to buy into this.
Herd them along. Well, if you're looking into your crystal ball, Whitney Webb, what country does the West have its eyes set on next after they take care of the Peru business?
Well, I would say that the next election in the Andean region is going to be Chile. There is a leftist candidate gaining a lot of traction named Daniel Jadue, and I don't think they're going to let him win at all. He's also the son of Palestinian immigrants, so that tends to not be favored by the U.S. establishment. That's for sure. Well, it's worth pointing out that Chile has like the highest concentration of people from Palestine outside of the Middle East. So there's a very strong, Palestinian community in Chile, and they actually have a lot of political agency and influence. So, it's different than it is in other countries for sure, including in Palestine itself. So there is some interesting dynamics there right now in their election, but Chilean politics are such a mess right now. Chile is such a mess. The way the whole COVID crisis has played out there. I mean, I actually had to leave over it. It's totally insane. Things over there right now, it's just really completely nuts. Chile's had its own domestic vaccine passport for domestic use since May, and it's a total disaster.
Yeah. Shit show.
Total shit show. But anyway, they have an election in November. I think they'll be focused on keeping Jadue from getting anywhere in the months leading up to that, in terms of, but I think if we want to see where they have their target on next, you just have to look at countries where there are these mineral resources. Are they going to have an election soon? Or is their existing government attempting to nationalize mines, tax mines, give contracts to China that the West thinks is theirs, and all of this stuff that tends to be something to look at. I think in Africa, if I remember correctly from the Tanzania piece I wrote, later this year, there's an election in, I think it's Zambia, can't quite remember, but one of the candidates there is openly campaigning on nationalizing the mines. So,
wow. Yeah.
That's something to look for. If there's a candidate going around talking about nationalizing mines in any of these countries with minerals deemed essential to the fourth revolution in it, you can expect election meddling.
Mm-hmm. The other day we saw that the FBI stopped, jailed a person for having a Lego set of the Capitol riot. We've seen what's been happening with the Biden administration and their surveillance tactics, both online and also calling everybody a domestic violent extremist, labeling pretty much every group that could possibly out there. You spoke about this happening, some event leading to this last year. With the circus that it's been, where do we go from here? Because what we have been talking about and screaming about endlessly is this Orwellian takeover, this Huxleyan and Orwellian gigantic reality that we have been starting, but now it's getting obvious and blatant right now.
Yeah, so the reason I was able to, I guess, predict something like January 6th happening during election season is because there was a really obvious pivot by people in DHS, the FBI, and the intelligence community. They essentially announced it during a congressional hearing last February that they were going to start basically doing it within the U.S., what they had done with Muslim extremists, i.e. entrapment, start focusing on white American males and focus on what they called anti-Semitic domestic terrorism specifically. In that hearing, anti-Semitic domestic terror was people on the left and people on the right. And if you follow a lot of U.S. Israel lobby talking points in the past year, specifically with sort of the collapse of pro-Israel narratives in the most recent bombing of Gaza and things like that, anti-Semitism on the left was blamed and was sort of promoted as an issue and all of that. But it's taken a couple different forms since last February and undergone some changes and what have you. But basically, the main point they were saying is it was going to be violent white supremacists and all of this stuff, and also violent extremists on the left, and the ones on the left and the right will work together, united by anti-Semitism. That was sort of like the theme of this congressional hearing. And in that hearing, this lady from DHS, Elizabeth Newman, basically said, we can see another 9/11 coming. It's building. It's going to happen, and we can't quite stop it. It won't be as bad as 9/11 in terms of the number of people dead or the visuals, but it will definitely be something like that. And then, of course, January 6th rolls around, and immediately it's being compared to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, all of this stuff, despite the fact that, like, how many people died, the fact that Capitol Police were on video waving people into the building, and all of this stuff. Where's the accountability there? Instead, people that were detained in relation with that are now in 23 hour out of 24-hour solitary confinement, and all of this stuff. I mean, it's pretty insane. But it's obviously, there needed to be some sort of justification for that pivot to domestic terrorism. I would argue that DHS and the pivot that led up to it, that really started back in 1997, was all about domestic terrorism and doing a war on domestic terrorism after the war on terrorism. And now we're basically essentially here. Another thing that happened last year that was very interesting is that every year the CIA does something they call the Worldwide Threat Assessment. And last year was the first year they did not do that. Instead, DHS, which has been around since 2003, chose last year to issue its first domestic threat assessment, talking about domestic terror. That, to me, was an obvious pivot by the intelligence apparatus of the US from worldwide foreign terror to domestic terror, the CIA passing the baton to DHS, essentially, because the CIA obviously does meddle in domestic affairs, but it's officially not supposed to. DHS is supposed to be the intelligence agency used domestically along with the FBI. And so those are the agencies that came out and underwent this major pivot last year. So, this is something that, and then of course happened under the Trump administration. And now it has been continued under Biden, yet another example of how this is an agenda that advances regardless of whether a Republican or Democrat is in power. And so if you actually look, for example, at the documentation of this domestic terror strategy, you will see that it is very easy to be a domestic terrorist in Biden's America, whether you are on the left or the right, showing, that this can be weaponized by either administration to go after really any group it chooses. So essentially, you can, if you read it, it'll say some people that oppose all forms of capitalism, that could easily be construed to be a socialist, a communist, anything like that. And many people who identify under those labels voted for Biden. But if you really, if some crazy Republican came to power, for example, anyone that voted for Bernie Sanders can be deemed a socialist by the US government and a domestic extremist. They really painted this with a super wide brush, and I just find that insanely concerning. It also says people that oppose corporate globalization. And this is interesting because by having those two together, this is when this new global effort to usher in a new economic model called stakeholder capitalism is taking place, which is basically corporate globalization and capitalism, with corporate globalization basically being the new government, the public and private sector coming together as stakeholders to rule over you in a new form of capitalism that these people assure us will be more inclusive and more sustainable. Trust them if you want, because the people leading this are like top CEOs of Silicon Valley, the heads of MasterCard and Visa. The Pope is on board, so that's great. But a lot of massive corporations are the ones that are supporting this. And so in theory, someone that opposes that system based on this strategy could also be deemed to be an extremist. And of course, you don't actually have to be violent or engage in violent acts. Spreading disinformation online is enough to be deemed a violent extremist in this strategy. And what's interesting is that this strategy was released several months after the World Economic Forum produced its partnership against cybercrime produced a document about what constitutes a cyber criminal. And oddly enough, in that partnership against cybercrime, you have some of the biggest corporations of the world led by the World Economic Forum, but members include the U.S. Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Secret Service. Of course, the Department of Justice wrote this strategy several months later for the U.S. specifically. But actually, it's quite similar to this WEF report in many ways. So, for example, they define cybercrime not just as someone who conducts like a ransomware attack or something like that, but also someone who posts disinformation online, and that their ability to use privacy-enhancing software, encryption, VPNs, or receive and send cryptocurrency should be restricted. They should potentially be arrested. Their website domains should be seized, and all of this stuff. And that partnership also calls for a lot of information sharing in between different governments and the private sector. And this is also something that Biden's domestic terror strategy calls for as well. And it's really no coincidence that you had by the Biden administration send John Kerry to talk to the World Economic Forum and say, we love what you guys are doing and we're going to implement it here faster than you can imagine. And that seems to be happening to a significant degree. And it's quite concerning. And one thing I do want to stress about this domestic terror strategy that I don't think is being talked about enough is that if you read it, they make it very clear it's a multinational strategy. So it's not just for the US. They plan to do information sharing and coordinate all of this with multiple other governments. It's very much set up in the same way that Operation Condor was in that regard. And of course, Operation Condor was a similar domestic terror hunting program. Really, in practice, it was domestic dissident hunting throughout Latin America in the 1980s, largely by US-backed military dictatorships. But Operation Condor was planned and then later supported directly by the CIA. And so you have US intelligence now sort of bringing that home to roost. And it's really no coincidence that the people that were responsible for doing that type of stuff in other countries abroad on behalf of US intelligence, whether it was in Vietnam or Latin America, are the same people responsible for the pivot to domestic terrorism and homeland security in the late 90s and after September 11th, 2001 in the US government. It's the same people. So, you know, what do you think they have in mind? And the people they targeted in those efforts abroad traditionally were the left. Operation Condor went after leftists or suspected leftists. And the same was true with the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was sort of the CIA's first rodeo in this type of stuff, where as many as 40,000 innocent people were assassinated. So the CIA has done this before. Now US intelligence is pointing the apparatus at the American people. It's not about hunting down white supremacists. They make this very clear. And if you think somehow in your brain that the Democrats and the Biden administration won't abuse these powers, please think very hard about what happens if a Republican comes to power, if you're still very much, you know, if you still think those parties are different. You know, what if the Republicans come to power and use this to go after their enemies? Well, yeah, anyone that comes to power after Biden can do that. And the Biden administration can do that too. It's a slippery slope. It's an awful policy. It needs to be stopped. And it's not about stopping Trump supporters and all of this stuff. I mean, there's so many, the polarization that happened in the Trump era has led like a lot of formerly perhaps rational people into just salivating over the idea of having as many Trump supporters as possible in prison. We need, those people really need to take a step back and realize that they have become the new neocons, like after 9/11, that were cheering up, you know, rounding up of imams and stuff in the US and that wanted that stuff to happen because they could be terrorists and all that stuff on the right. You have become that now, but in the reverse. And that's not good because I mean, a lot of the heroes of the resistance or whatever, were people like John Brennan, a former CIA director. Those people are there to lie to you and to manipulate the left into cheering on the same forces that have historically engineered their murder and destruction in countries around the world, or in COINTELPRO and other things, within the US. So, I really would, the Trump derangement syndrome is one of the key drivers, I think, even still, of the people that actually support this policy, but it's extremely dangerous. And really, if fully implemented, it will turn the U.S. into a dictatorship, no question. But I still think that they need some sort of big event to really get people on board. January 6th wasn't enough. There needs to be some sort of other incident that pushes people over the edge. They won't have time to think about it. They'll just react and be like, round them up. And they've already set up all this infrastructure. They've announced this is what they plan to do. They've already said Facebook is now piloting this thing. Do you think your friend's an extremist?
Yeah.
Get support, report them. DHS is saying, if you have a family member or a friend you think is an extremist, report them. Snitching on your family and friends. This has happened in other countries. We need to remember history. It does not go well. Yeah. To give an example, one of my friends when I was living in Chile, his grandmother did not get along with his grandmother. She was very right wing. She had a neighbor she didn't like during the Pinochet era. Not a fan of this lady, obviously. And she hated her neighbor for some dumb reason and reported her to the police as being a communist sympathizer. No evidence for that at all. And the woman was disappeared. I mean, that type of stuff can happen here if we allow it. And the fact that there's people on the left, when there's so much historical evidence of this being used against the left in abroad and also, in the US, I mean, this is just crazy that we have so many people rubber stamping this and saying, go on, as long as the people we don't like are locked up, it's okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to have to report you, fams. You guys are vegans and you guys made the list. So you're DVEs because you're vegans and whatnot. Whitney, I see all this going around, this kind of juggling by the predator class, right? I think the easy tactic, the easy thing on the list is, America. You said it before, it's easy to divide us. They laugh at us. They got us divided. And, they're in a race for natural resources, all these minerals all over Africa, South America, and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But you also talked about cryptocurrencies, whatnot. I just wanted to get your take while we're still on kind of South America and the whole DVE thing, and about the crypto that's going into play. Is there going to be a push by the United States government to go, hell no, you're not going to Bitcoin. We're going to go in there and we're going to remove you,
Yes.
So.
Yeah, that's what my most recent report that is going to go up later today. It's really long, but I encourage you to read it. Is actually all about. It's all about this World Economic Forum partnership against cybercrime, all their different partners and all of this. But in there, I talk about specifically the U.S. government. They're using the ransomware events that have taken place recently to justify a complete crackdown on Bitcoin specifically, but to regulate crypto markets. And this is actually because I would argue the central bank of the US, the Federal Reserve, is trying to make a digital dollar. They've been talking about it for several months, the central bank digital currency. In the UK, they're making one too. The Bank of England is making Britcoin, as they call it. China, for years, has been working on its digital yuan project. They implement the digital yuan project, and right after they crack down on Bitcoin mining, they go after companies. They've gone after companies now that just provide ads and marketing services to cryptocurrency related companies. So just essentially just totally crushing and regulating that market as much as possible, because when they implement these central bank digital currencies, they're not as attractive as cryptocurrencies for several reasons. One of which, if you look at the digital yuan, you're not allowed to save it. They give you an expiration date on the money. So you have to spend it before that date. You can't save, you can't decide what you do with your own funds. You have to spend it before the government says it loses its value and stuff like that. Cryptocurrency obviously doesn't have that. And if you set it up right, you have control over it if you don't have it on an exchange, and you control your keys and all of this stuff, right? I'm not a huge expert here, but it just obviously seems more attractive than a digital version of a central bank controlled currency when central banks are corrupt and in the US dominated by Wall Street. So, the promise of cryptocurrency, right, was that it's decentralized and not part of the Wall Street Federal Reserve mafia. And so, obviously, if they want to make a digital currency, that same mafia, they have to get cryptocurrency out of the way to force mass adoption of the one they are making. And so that's inevitable. So as a consequence of this ransomware stuff, you have people in Congress, like this representative from Illinois, Bill Foster, saying there's this sentiment in Congress now that if you engage in anonymous crypto transaction, you are considered to be de facto part of a criminal conspiracy. Wow. Those are his words. He didn't say criminal crypto transaction. He just said anonymous crypto transaction. So I would argue what's going on here is that they want what we're seeing in the U.S. right now is an unprecedented effort to surveil everyone to the greatest extent possible, including to extents that no one really ever thought the government would ever try and do. And so part of that is eliminating the ability to have anonymous financial transactions. And that's not just in the digital world, also cash. Efforts to phase out cash have just totally grown in the past year, with a lot of banks and other groups hinting that soon cash should be outlawed altogether. When COVID first started, they were saying, oh, well, you can pass germs and the virus on bills, so we have to get rid of bills and all of this stuff. But those efforts have picked up since then as well. So, it's really about anonymity in general. And this same partnership against cybercrime also essentially wants you to have a government issued ID in order to access the internet, period, or to use social media and all of this. And this was actually an Obama administration policy. They called it a driver's license for the internet. It didn't take off because groups like the EFF and ACLU threatened to take them to court and all of this. But now with this whole ransomware cyber pandemic, as they are calling it, they can just be like, well, we have to stop cybercrime, so you have to have an ID to get on the internet, and you can't have anonymity, period, online. And so that's essentially where this is going. So anyone that's planning on holding cryptocurrency for the long term, I would encourage you to read this report so you know what these people are planning, because it's not just the World Economic Forum, right? You have to look at the people that are members of this, and it's members of Israel's government, the UK government, and the US government. As I mentioned earlier, in the US, it's the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Secret Service. You have massive banks involved in this. Actually, there's a lot of banks involved in this period, which is pretty interesting and plays a lot into the whole financial angle there. They're very focused on clamping down on the financial world, using ransomware as the excuse. But if you look at something like Colonial Pipeline, the FBI was able to reacquire almost all of the Bitcoin that was paid as ransom. So do they really need to eliminate anonymity online to stop this? I don't really know. And also, I don't think so anyway. And, if you consider the fact that cyber attacks have been going on since the 80s and 90s, well before cryptocurrency was around, even if you magically take cryptocurrency out of the equation, cybercrime will find a different way to operate. So, I would argue this is really about something else at the end of the day, and plays into this whole effort to just advance surveillance to a completely insane level.
Just to kind of wrap it up, you were doing some reporting on the connections between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein. Can you give us some more insight into their relationship?
Yes. So if you believe, well, so that report was really long, so I'm just going to try and give a summary. If you believe the mainstream media narrative, then you will believe that Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein didn't know each other until the year 2011. However, there's a very prominent UK newspaper called the Evening Standard that in 2001, before Epstein was notorious for anything, said that Jeffrey Epstein made all of his money because of three men, Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and Bill Gates. That's pretty weird for Bill Gates to get a mention then, considering the fact that they didn't supposedly meet until 10 years later. And of course, the journalist that wrote this is very well known in the UK, never retracted it. There was no pushback from the millions of people that read this article. which by the way, included a lot about Prince Andrew and the royal family. If there was lies in there, don't you think the royal family would have pushed back at the time? No, because Epstein wasn't notorious, so there was no reason to. And these people had no complaints at the time about that, right? So if you go back and you look farther, it starts to look very hard for Bill Gates not to have known of Jeffrey Epstein, who Jeffrey Epstein was. Maybe they didn't physically meet until 2011, but I kind of doubt that. They seem to have known each other quite well if you look at the evidence. So there's a couple things there. One is that Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Isabel Maxwell, who openly brags about inheriting the espionage portfolio from Israel from her father, literally says this, I quote it in the report, it's pretty astounding, was recruited by an Israeli IDF-founded tech company to be the head of this company because she was her father's daughter, essentially. If you're not familiar with Robert Maxwell, he's often described as Israel's super spy, among other things. So that's pretty significant. Basically, this company was considered an obscure software developer until the two co-founders of Microsoft, Paul Allen and Bill Gates, put the company on the map. Those are Isabel Maxwell's words. And in an article from 2000, Isabel Maxwell acts super weird when talking about Bill Gates. I've read like hundreds of interviews this woman has given. This is the only one where, according to the journalist, she starts purring and speaking in a fake American Southern accent. Normally she has like a slight British accent. And she starts talking about how she had to convince Bill Gates somehow to keep her tax-free status by giving money to her company, and then starts giggling uncontrollably. That's super weird. It's just really weird.
You think?
And it doesn't make any sense for either him or Paul Allen to have invested in this company, because the year before they just had $4 million in losses and they'd never turned a profit the whole time. So what financially were they getting out of this company? Not much. Must have been something else. So basically the way she says it and the tax-free status thing, it must have been one of the investment vehicles of the Gates Foundation that was created in 2000 that was used to pump up this company and its share price before their IPO. And it was actually Microsoft that integrated them into parts of Hotmail, among other things, that got them their first big contract. And this is insane because Isabel Maxwell was directly involved in her father's efforts to backdoor U.S. government communications on behalf of Israel. And what is known as the Promise software scandal. Isabel Maxwell worked for the front company that sold that to classified U.S. laboratories in the 1980s. So, I mean, don't you think they would have reviewed this and been like, this is problematic? Well, if you look at other stuff that was going on with Microsoft in the 1990s, you will know that Epstein was very close to Nathan Myhrvold, Bill Gates' top advisor, and the chief technology officer of Microsoft, responsible for the development of all of its products, flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane twice, and not only was accused by Virginia Giuffre of exploiting and sexually assaulting minors, but also Alan Dershowitz, surprisingly. Basically, when he was accused by Virginia Giuffre, he said, "Oh no, that wasn't me, that was Nathan Myhrvold," essentially saying, "Oh, he's the one that did this." And that got no media coverage, despite the fact that this is a high-ranking tech executive, very powerful guy. And Epstein traveled with Myhrvold in 1998 to the Microsoft Russia conference and was involved in that. So obviously was involved in Microsoft activities to a significant degree. And also a Microsoft vice president at the time, Linda Stone, also very close to Epstein. Her contact information was through a woman called Kelly Bovino, who has been named by several Epstein victims as central to his trafficking network, and is also in Epstein's little black books, among other things. And Linda Stone was the person that told Joy Ito, the now disgraced MIT Media Lab that had to resign in the wake of the Epstein scandal in 2019, that even though Epstein had a tainted past, he's totally awesome and you should take money from him. Don't worry about it. He's great. Everyone loves Jeffrey. So, you know, and so there's several Microsoft executives here that were involved with that. And then before Isabel Maxwell's company even got involved with Bill Gates, in 1995, the company she ran with her sister Christine, who would go on to create a homeland security software with the then head of information security for the CIA, they together had a company that made a huge deal with Microsoft in 1995. And Ghislaine Maxwell was a massive shareholder in that. And we don't know how involved she was in the company's operations, but in several media reports throughout the 1990s, she said her job was an internet operator. And this was supposed to be one of the earliest search engines that was run on the MSN network called Magellan. So we know that during the 90s, Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein's finances were quite entangled. So that may have been the origin of these business ties. But it's hard to know because no one with resources will actually report on this. I'm me. I can only do so much, but people at the New York Times and mainstream media have had no interest in pursuing this information. They've just been like, well, 2011, that's when it happened, and won't look into it anymore. But obviously, I think the reason why they don't want to look into it is because you start to notice that not just Bill Gates, but multiple top Microsoft executives were very involved with Jeffrey Epstein. And one of the top ones, we can very credibly say, was sexually blackmailed by him, because I didn't even go in to the witnesses that saw Epstein take minors into Nathan Myhrvold's office when he left Microsoft in 2000 and set up a separate firm called Intellectual Ventures. I mean, obviously, something very shady was going on between those two men. So the fact that you have an intelligence-linked pedophile that sexually blackmails people, having all these ties with top Microsoft executives, makes it not a problem for Bill Gates anymore. It makes it a problem for Microsoft. And Microsoft, for example, they recently just lost the Pentagon cloud contract, but they're a major contractor for the U.S. government. Tons of companies and all the stuff around the world use Microsoft products. The fact that foreign intelligence and specifically the Epstein-linked intelligence network could have backdoor access, maybe, or some sort of other thing related to Microsoft products that's of concern. That could be that's easily the biggest scandal in the history of Microsoft as a company. Period. It could totally destroy it. So that's probably why they won't pursue it, because at that point, once you go before 2011, it's not about Bill Gates anymore. It's about Microsoft.
Yeah. Johnny, do you have a question or no? Whitney, we're going to get you out of here because we know it's the top of the hour and you got to go. I was just kind of figuring out that like all the Epstein connections, whatnot, with Bill Gates and everything like that, if it had something to do with why everything is so quiet at the Zorro Epstein ranch. In other words, we heard so much about the island. We've heard nothing about Epstein's ranch.
It was never raided. The Zorro ranch was never raided. And a lot of about what went on there is very suspect. There's a few Epstein associates and also victims in the 1990s that say that Epstein and Ghislaine were talking about opening a surgery center there to do surgery on some of these women, cosmetic surgery or whatever. But we know that Epstein was into really freaky, creepy science, eugenics, transhumanism, all of this stuff. And that's mainstream media reporting that. It's like the New York Times and stuff making those claims, not me, right? So, obviously there's some weird things that were going on there, and there's no interest in investigating it. Obviously, just like the federal government in general has no interest in meaningfully investigating the Epstein case.
Yeah. It seems like Tim Dillon can get a lot of good jokes from that right over there, that area right there when you said that. Yeah. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
And for getting up early. Thank
you.
Yeah. We'll always get up early for Whitney.
We'd love to have you on again sometime. Best of luck, and I look forward to reading your paper.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Whitney Webb, y'all.
Yeah, y'all. So let's read some of your super rays.
Super rays.
Recording stopped.
Aww.
Let's do that.
Trey Wright, hello, fam. Thank you so much for the Super Ray contribution. It's always appreciated on the couch. Matthew S. Dore.
What?
Thank you for the Super Ray contribution. It's always appreciated on the couch. Same with Billum. It's always
I think you owed me one.
Reeve Barker, it's always appreciated on the couch.
Cheating.
No offense, it's always appreciated on the couch. El Brillante, I appreciate the quality of the work Convo Couch is doing. I am better informed because of what you do. Thank you. Thank you. That's so nice.
I love hearing that.
Shadow Band refugee, always around, man. The guy doesn't sleep. Endlessly simping for Whitney Webb and Fiorella. Thanks for the lovely convo. You conspiracy smoothie drinking fams, you. Odele. Thanks for having Whitney on. Love you guys. That's from Almighty Antichrist.
Oh.
I almost said Almighty Anarchist, but I said it right. Shadow Band refugee. I am in an abusive relationship with Whitney Webb. Every time I see her, she breaks my heart and shatters my hopes and dreams. But I still keep watching. I never stop loving having my eyelids forced open and my preconceived notions broken into pieces. Whitney Webb is a saint, says the Shadow Band refugee. And Sully, hashtag free Assange, hashtag free Ross. Who's Ross?
Ross? No, I don't know.
Thank you guys so much for joining in this morning so early. A dingo ate me, baby. Everybody else. Got anything to say, Johnny, or show before we get out? All right, ladies and gentlemen. So that's it for now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, guys. Try to digest that. Take that a little bit. Eat it. Yeah. And check out Whitney's work at Unlimited Hangout. Of course, we didn't really get a chance to promote it, but she's on there. She's on T-Lab, and she's been doing great work. Like, I am ready to read that crypto report she's going to drop. That's going to be intense. So
it's very kind of concerning and stuff. Like, at the end of the day, we don't know what can really happen and stuff. And the great thing about Whitney is, like, you learn so much, but then you're scared shitless as well after the interview. You're like, okay, what are we going to do now?
Yeah.
Maybe we can go to space.
Well, I love how she said there's another event, because I agree. You were saying that too, and we were talking about like how I think they expected it to be
a lot worse.
Yeah, and the pandemic isn't doing it. People are resisting that. People are resisting, this whole white supremacy. And it's crazy because like I didn't even get to like say I had an argument yesterday. I talked about what people like Jordan Cheriton were saying about the trauma and all this stuff. Like, it just plays right into their hand, dude. It just plays right into their hand, guys. So,
yeah. Well, my last question would be, what's the solution? What do we do?
Yeah.
How do we, the people, get actual power and take it away from these psychopaths? Because they're doing what they're doing right now, and it's like they got full control of us. And like I think it was a show Whitney said not too long ago. I think it might have been Slow News Day. She's like, look at the Americans, the elites or the predator class must be going, it's so easy to divide you, ha ha. Yeah. And it is. It's like I think they have less issues dealing with the Peru or going after those natural resources or regime change than they do over here in America. America's like the easy thing. It's like we'll just turn the people against each other and then we'll run off with all the resources. Scotty Johnson, Scotty J, thank you for the super great contribution. As always, appreciate it on the couch. And Sarah Wagner, thank you so much, guys. That's it, fam. Let's get on out.
Alrighty. Carrie Mark, nice to see you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for Pasta Jardula.
Fiorella.
Johnny Sue on the ones and twos.
Convo out.
Love